So the Brock Purdy discourse, we thought it had gone out of control 2-3 months ago. I thought it was out of control over the course of the offseason, but somehow maybe it's the state of the world that we live in. It just keeps getting worse. In fact, it's this inverse correlation with Brock Purdy's accomplishments. The more that he does on the football field, the greater the hate for whatever he's done becomes. It's literally inversely correlated. Delivers a playoff come from behind drive. Stuff that all the greats had to do after they had struggled at times during the playoffs. That's why we brought up the Joe Montana game example, multiple games actually from Joe Montana. That's why you could bring up the Tom Brady examples when he struggled in the playoffs. You could bring up so many of the great names. Part of the building of a legacy is overcoming struggles to deliver in the postseason, preferably in come from behind fashion. Brock Purdy did that. Brock Purdy also did this over the larger sample size in the regular season. That's him at the very top right, most accurate and efficient quarterback and most efficient quarterback in the league. Then he turned around and did what he did in the postseason, and then the talking just will not stop. The negativity will not stop. Now, he's got a lot of people who see this for what it is, who tell the truth, who see this for reality. I get that. But for some reason, there just are such vocal segments of the talking heads and the media that are going out of their way to try to denigrate it. I don't really understand, but the reason that it's worth bringing up is because it might become a motivating factor for the San Francisco 49ers. Here's Deebo Samuel. Never seen so much hate for a QB that leads the league in almost every category. The tape doesn't tell any lies. Again, Deebo Samuel knows this. I mean, Deebo plays with Brock Purdy, and he watches the tape. He actually watches the tape. Let me go out and say something there. There are a lot of people that say that they watch the tape, but they either don't actually watch the tape or they don't even know what to begin to look for when they watch the tape. Tape is a complicated thing. You can't just sit there with Madden video game knowledge and think, oh, he made a nice deep pass. Yeah, I mean, but even if the argument is he's, who's throwing deeper, who's making throws further downfield, even if that's the argument, Purdy holds up just fine. He threw downfield way more often than Josh Allen this past weekend in the playoff game, threw the same number of passes, 39 as Josh Allen. Purdy was the highest completion percentage, the best completion percentage on PFF's record, which goes back 2+ decades on throws of 20 or more yards this year. He led efficiency in the league to all levels of the field. So even if that's your standard, then you still come to the same conclusion if you're dealing in facts. But if you're not dealing in facts, that's when you start to get to takes like this. How does Brock Purdy beat any of these dudes? Allen and Mahomes, Baltimore, Lamar. That's what Ryan Clark, the former safety, said. Richard Sherman brought some reason to the table, just like Deebo Samuel. Here's Deebo Samuel bringing reason to the table, knowing that this is the truth with Brock Purdy. This is what's reflective of the tape. Then Richard Sherman said, I don't know how we hold a second-year QB who has gone to the NFC Championship game in both of his first 2 years to the same standard as all the elite QBs, but none of the credit when he plays elite. 3-1 record in the playoffs, and he hadn't lost a playoff game in which he has started and finished. So I would say the fair way to look at it is 3-0 record in the playoffs with the injury and the loss to Philadelphia last year counting as a wash. I just don't know, RC, Ryan Clark, initials. Just seems that regardless of what he does, he won't have the quote-unquote talent of the other guys. Sherman's theory is the same as Trent Williams' theory, that because Brock Purdy was drafted late, there is a concerted effort amongst people who don't want to look bad to find new and invent new holes in his game because he obviously skipped out on so much of the evaluation process. It's probably at this point even deeper than that. There's a level of ego investment and doubling down despite the data absolutely flying in people's faces. I mean, we could look at this. We've looked at the tape so many times. It just at this point doesn't seem to matter what Brock Purdy does. It could be so off the chart statistically, like what I just showed you, or you could see the actual plays during the games, and you could see the scrambling ability, you can see the accuracy, you can see the poise in the pocket, you can see the overcoming of adversity. But it doesn't matter what he does; people are just going to get dug in on their positions. And that's where I go back to the state of discourse on everything, not just football, but the state of discourse on everything seems to just be so polarized. And this Brock Purdy situation is just embodying the polarization that we see everywhere in the world today. Just an argumentative world. I get it. Social media is probably an argumentative place, especially Twitter, where this is probably, well, Twitter and also the little viral snippets they shoot for on talking head shows. You're going for lack of nuance. And if you go for lack of nuance, you're going to take stuff out of context. You're going to take the Brock Purdy, Joe Montana game comparison that I made, obviously, way out of context, even though it's perfectly accurate. You're going to not want to see the gray area that exists with every single quarterback who won the game. Joe Montana wasn't a machine who threw 5 touchdowns and 370 yards every single time he took the field. Joe Montana was once a young quarterback, just like Brock Purdy, who was a little bit overlooked coming out of college, a third-round draft pick out of Notre Dame, and he actually was at the helm of some losing teams before the 49ers turned it around in his third year, and they went 13-3. And that NFC Championship game of that 1981 season is when Joe Montana threw 3 interceptions. The 49ers turned the ball over 6 times, and he finally turned it around at age 25 to lead the 49ers on that drive and throw what became the catch. And I was at the memorial service for Dwight Clark, and Joe Montana was at that memorial service, and he still had one of the better one-liners that we'll hear because he was such good friends with Dwight. So they had that rapport off the field, on the field, and then even after Dwight's passing, Joe Montana said, "You know, Dwight, I still remember when you would always tell me, Joe, they don't call it the throw for a reason. They call it the catch." The good old school little ribbing between Joe Montana and Dwight Clark goes back a long way till 1981. Still, legendary moment. It was a great throw. It was a great catch, and that's where the heroic nature of Joe Montana was born, right? He was 25 years old then. It's about judging Brock Purdy through the lens that we should judge him as a quarterback who just turned 24. He literally turned 24 in late December. So at Candlestick Park in January of 1982, when Joe Montana was throwing his 3 interceptions, and then he turned it around and marched down the field to throw the catch, nobody knew that he was going to win 4 Super Bowls and go to the Hall of Fame. But nobody, because people didn't have Twitter back then, probably. Maybe if they had Twitter, they'd be talking differently. But people weren't burying him, at least in the way that people are trying to bury Brock Purdy right now for playing 3 substandard quarters before turning it around. So back in an era of slower discourse, more thoughtful discourse, we had more nuance. Now we're missing the nuance. Now it's either Brock Purdy's terrible or he's awesome, whatever. He can do no wrong. I don't think that side is nearly as problematic. I think that most of the people who recognize how good Brock Purdy has been are also looking at the fact that he's 24 years old, has obviously made some mistakes on the field, but, was making mistakes all the way through his prime into his late years. Well, every single quarterback who's ever played the game. This is not a mistake-free game. Football is organized chaos. So it might be social media that's fueling a lot of this stuff, but it probably also is video game mentality. I think there's a lot of people playing Madden, got really good at Madden, think playing quarterback is as easy as hitting a couple buttons. And when that happens, well, you hit a couple buttons and you think that the guys on the NFL field should just hit a couple buttons and move the team downfield. But the reality is you're dealing with pass rushers flying in your face. You're dealing with defensive schemes that have evolved over the years that are morphing after the snap, disguising coverages. This stuff is moving faster than anybody watching this show right now can possibly imagine, unless there are a couple NFL players watching. There might be. I don't know. It says there are 1,126 people watching. I don't know who exactly is part of that audience. Maybe Sherman is watching. I talked to Richard Sherman today. And his main point was he thinks that Brock Purdy, if he wins the Super Bowl, if the 49ers win it this year, this stuff will finally quiet down. Richard Sherman thinks that the kind of the benchmark moment, the watershed moment in some of these QB wars, because he's seen some of them in the past. I don't know if he's ever seen something as intense as what Brock Purdy is surrounded with right now, but winning a Super Bowl tends in this black and white era where people just care about terrific or trash, or they care about title or bust. Winning a Super Bowl as intellectually, you know, lacking as it is, it seems to be what really calms people down. There's so much else that goes into winning a Super Bowl in a team sport. I get it. So it almost makes me cringe that you just have to win a Super Bowl and then all criticism goes away. It doesn't make any sense to me. I think that a quarterback is still going to be making mistakes on the way to, during, and after the Super Bowl. So we could still judge the gray area. We could still be smart about it. We don't have to be black and white on one side. But I think since the black and white nature of the debate did get us to this point of the discourse, which is out of control. It's sad. And I'll mention why it's sad here in a little bit, because we got here through black and white thinking. Maybe it's the black and white thinking that gets us out of it. Maybe Brock Purdy actually does need to win the Super Bowl. And then all of a sudden people will flip and just flip that switch and think about this in a completely different way, which would still be problematic, because I think at the core, it's the fact that we can't look at the gray area with Brock Purdy. That's the issue. There's also people who pretend to look at the gray area and they're like, oh no, like I see this from both sides. He's good, but he's not elite. And that's just pretending to look at this in a fair way. Right now, the data shows where Brock Purdy is. And if he continues this trajectory for over a decade, he's going to end up in some legendary places. Obviously, the sample is not big enough to know where he's going to end up as a legacy. But the point is that we're looking at this in a moment of time. And a 24-year-old quarterback, somebody who just turned 24, so he's 23 when he put up most of the numbers behind this graph. A 24-year-old quarterback is pacing the league. A 24-year-old who was the very last pick of the 2022 NFL draft. And I mentioned it's sad. Why is it sad? Well, because this on the surface, what I just showed you is one of the great stories in NFL history. The very last draft pick, overlooked by everybody, shows up out of nowhere and begins dominating, begins doing this, is undefeated in playoff games that he's finished. That's a story to celebrate. That's like the American underdog story. Yet somehow it's become the most divisive issue in the NFL today. I don't see people arguing really about anything else than this. Oh, it is certifiably wild to see what's going on here with the Brock Purdy discourse. Wanted to bring to light the Deebo Samuel comment and the Richard Sherman comment. The discourse has gotten out of control, but the 49ers might be motivated by it in the NFC Championship game. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.